Up Philippians today. We've been going through Philippians for the last several weeks, and we've tried to hit on a lot of different verses in Philippians. I'm going to recall some of the verses this morning we did last week, but one verse in particular kind of stuck with us through, kind of guided my thinking all the way through the book. Is really early in the book, Philippians 1:6. He says, I'm convinced of this, that he who began a good work in you will carry it on to completion into the day of Christ Jesus. That God, who started something with you when you made a decision to be a believer, really started something with you before you even knew about God. On the cross 2,000 years ago, started something with you when you made a decision to give your life to Him, still working on you. And as you have lived your life, God is still working on you, trying to take you to where He wants you to be. And this is the life of a Christian. When I look at my own life, I see how God has carried me through a lot of different things that I would not have dreamed would have been what I would do, but God has taken me there. I really didn't want to go into ministry and fought that pretty hard for 3 or 4 years, but it just felt like that's what He wanted me to do, and so I kind of committed to give it a shot, and we'll see how it goes, and then I can do something else if I want to, and I've never really wanted to do anything else. God just keeps working on me. And sometimes He takes me to places that I wouldn't have guessed. He took us, our first ministry was in Tennessee, and we were youth ministers. And I wasn't that cool and popular when I was in high school. I'm less cool and popular now that I'm older and balding. But I did it, and God worked on us, and He brought a lot of kids in, and that was cool, and I really enjoyed it. It was a lot of fun. And then He took us, we felt like we were called and led to go out to California. And the town that we lived in was 70 or 80% Hispanic. And so white people were kind of in the minority. And I'm not just a white person, I'm a white person, right? And so I stood out a lot there. And I thought, well, there's no way I'll be any good doing anything here. And God worked through us there. And we were able to get some stuff going on. And it was cool. And God stretched us on both those things. And He's stretching us here, and God keeps doing it. And I'm convinced of this, that God who began a good work in me is taking me someplace. I bring up the history stuff, the California stuff, partly to get into something I wanted to talk about this morning. When I was in California, sometimes I would have to preach. I chose to preach in the Spanish service. We had 2 English services and 1 Spanish service. My Spanish is pretty poor, and so I would have a translator. We tried once or twice to have me write the sermon in Spanish and read it, but my accent was so poor that people still couldn't understand what I was saying. Or they couldn't understand me very well. So I would have a translator, and it was Susan Mian who would translate for me, and she was fantastic. And you got to where you could develop a rhythm, like you would say some little thing, and then she would do her thing in Spanish, and you would work your way through it, and you had to be a little shorter, because you're using twice as many words to get the same points across. And her only rule that she said is, no idioms, no metaphors. Just be really literal about everything, because idioms don't always translate. We'd be preaching along and and I'm getting this rhythm, and then I would say something like, "We're just going around in circles," or banging my head against the wall, and instead of going it would be like and then she'd look at me mad. I can't believe you did that, because it doesn't translate. And there's just certain things in Spanish that don't translate into English. Certain things in English that don't translate to Spanish. You've got to really explain everything you're trying to say. It doesn't make sense. And the verse that we're going to get into today is that kind of a verse. It just doesn't totally make sense if you take the verse and put it just in American context. You need to understand what Paul was saying with this verse. And so we're going to spend some time getting there. I do have one story about this, and I think it's a funny story. It doesn't really relate to the sermon. It's just a funny story, and I like funny stories. It was our associate minister there, Clay. His Spanish was pretty good, and he frequently spoke in the Spanish service, but he was still learning the language. It wasn't his natural language. He was learning it, but he would preach every Sunday, and sometimes he would make mistakes, and they would get on him hard about it. But the hardest they ever got on him about anything was one Sunday, our air conditioning was kind of suspect. It was working, but it just wasn't working real well. We were going to have to replace one of the units, and a lot of times on church, you don't realize it's broken until Sunday morning, and then it was this big deal. And And so we had all these fans set up, and we're trying to watch people, because it's really hot outside. It was over 100, and we could get the room temperature down to about 80, but it was still really warm in there. And so Clay gets up in front of everybody, and in Spanish says, if any of you ladies are caliente, come talk to me, and I'll take care of it. And caliente means hot, unless you're talking about people, and then it means turned on in Spanish. That's what it means. So Clay got up and said, if any of you ladies are turned on, come talk to me and I'll take care of it. And so there's like this awkward pause, right? Did he say that? I mean, is that what he meant to say? And then they realize he has no idea what he said, right? Then they all start laughing at him, and they just rode him hard for years about this thing. Asked him if he was caliente and different things, and it was awful. Okay, but that idea, right? Some things don't translate. There's a verse I want to talk about, and it's really just one verse I want to talk about, but you have to understand the context of it. And I know some of this can be kind of dry, and I'll try to go through it as quick as I can, but you got to understand the context of this verse, because if you don't get the context of the verse and get it, then you're going to lose something in the translation of it. Now, some of the verses are stuff we talked about last week, and I can go over those again. We looked at this last week. He says, I've learned, and this is Paul talking, I've learned to be content, he says, whatever the circumstances. I know what it's like to be in need and what it's like to have plenty, but I've learned, he says, the secret of being content in any and every situation, no matter how much I have. And I want you to catch all that he's saying here. The secret, right, is this notion that not everybody's going to get it. Some people are going to live their life, and they're going to live and die, and they're going to be discontent. They're never going to... there's going to be this fatigue about their life. They're never going to know the joy of the Lord. They're never going to get there. Some of the people who are like that are going to be well fed, and they're going to live in plenty. They're going to be children who were born into a fairly prosperous house and lived their whole lives prosperous. Their whole life, they had a great house to live in. Their whole life, they had great clothes to wear. New car smell was a frequent smell for them. It's what they lived in. And yet, in spite of having that their whole life, they were discontent. Paul says, not everybody figures this out. But I've learned it, he says. He didn't learn it in a Bible study. He learned it because he lived it. And there's a notion that some things you have to be older to figure out. A 20-year-old won't have as good a grasp on it as a 40-year-old. A 40-year-old won't know as much as an 80-year-old. That there's just some things you have to live to understand. But Paul's telling you the secret. So the benefit is no matter how old you are, what Paul's learned the hard way, you can pick up immediately. And it's all this thing here. He says, I can do all things, all this through Christ who gives me strength. That's the lesson, right? Whenever Paul would find himself struggling with discontentment, which everybody does occasionally, he would turn back to Christ. He would think about what Jesus has done for him in the past, how about the cross, about the song we sang earlier, it's well in my soul, right? Though Satan should buffet, I think back at what Christ has done on that cross. I know that one day the Lord's going to return, the trump will sound, God's going to take me. And when Paul would put his mind back on Christ, he found that he could do all things through him, that there was a strength in following Jesus. And we talked about this a lot last week, and I don't want to pound away at it again, but this is important, that a lot of Christians, I think, don't ever totally figure this out, and they don't ever totally trust God all the way. And when you live that way, it really is the worst of all worlds. You've got enough of a foot in the church that you feel guilty that you're not doing more. But you've got enough of a foot in the world that you can't really jump all the way in and enjoy those things. You're just kind of half into everything. Paul says the secret is to give it all to him. And then he strengthens you. Now, Paul said all this, this part about being, I've learned the secret. It's all in response. They had sent him an offering, the Philippians had. They had sent him a gift, a financial gift. And Paul's telling them, hey, listen, really appreciate the gift, but I don't need it because God's taking care of me. And he's going to go on with that theme. We looked at that all last week. Going on, he says, it was good for you to share in my troubles. And moreover, as you Philippians know, in the early days of your acquaintance with the gospel, when I set out from Macedonia is the state that Philippi is the city in, like Indianapolis and Indiana, right? So as you Philippians know, in the early days of your acquaintance with the gospel, when I set out from Macedonia, not one church shared with me in the matter of giving and receiving, just you guys. Even when I was in Thessalonica, which is a whole other city there, you guys sent me aid. The Thessalonians, we have a book in our Bible, Thessalonians, that's what he's talking about there. They didn't help me, but you were constantly helping me. And we don't know a lot about Philippi. We don't know a lot about Macedonia from the Bible, but when it is mentioned in Corinthians, Paul says they were a very poor region. They didn't have a lot of money, but they were generous. I mean, they saw Paul in his bind, and they sent money. They tried to take care of him. They cared, right? And Paul says, man, I really appreciate it. You shared in my troubles. I mean, when I was down, you were right there, and you came. So he's thankful for it, and it'd be wrong to assume that Paul is so content in Christ that he rejects all help because he's so content, you know. I mean, it's okay if somebody gives you a hand if you're hurting to take that hand, and that doesn't ruin anything. But he goes on, back to the same thing he was saying earlier. But I don't desire gifts. This is what I desire, is that more will be credited to your account. And we'll talk about this more in a second, but it's this notion that whatever you do, giving-wise, God's keeping track. And it would be wrong to take that verse like, okay, one guy gave $10 and this guy gave 100, so he gets 10 times more blessing. That's not what he's saying. He's just saying your generosity. You know, I mean, when I was in need, you guys came through, and God notices that. I don't think that anybody ever regrets being generous. I don't think there's ever a time when you're going to be generous and you're going to look back and say, boy, I was stupid for being generous. I don't think people ever do that. Sometimes you might give money to somebody and realize that you were taken advantage of. That can happen, I suppose. Sometimes you might give money to somebody and realize later that they scammed you. That can hurt your feelings. But when you're really generous and you're really helping somebody out who needs something, I don't think you ever look back and feel bad about that. I think it's one of those things that you know kind of intuitively that it's good. And Paul's saying that. He says, God's watching. And he says, so I'm fine. I've received full payment. I have more than enough. I'm amply supplied. Remember, Paul's in prison when he's writing this. And all this stuff looks back to what he said before. I know what it's like to have need. I know what it's like to have plenty. I can do all things through Christ who gives me strength. So he says, I have enough. I mean, wherever I'm at, I've got enough. God is taking care of me. Thankful for what you did, but God is taking care of me. And so there's this tension, right? And I'm getting to the verse I want to talk about, but there's this tension in all of Paul's stuff. Grateful for what you're doing. It's good to give, but I'm fine. He says, when you give, the next verse, it's like an offering to God. When you give something, you give some money to the guy with the cardboard sign, it's like you're giving to God. You give some money to the person who doesn't have anything, and you show some generosity. It's like you're making an offering to God, and God's keeping track. Okay, all of that's foundation for one verse. I really just want to preach about one verse today. All the rest of it is just foundation. Here's the verse. My God will meet all your needs according to the riches of his glory in Christ Jesus. This is Philippians 4:19. It's the last verse there. My God will meet all your needs. Now, this verse has been mistranslated by lots of people. Joel Osteen mistranslates this verse. Kenneth Copeland has a long thing where he mistranslates this verse. There's a whole notion of teaching called the prosperity gospel, which takes this verse to mean that God's going to take care of you if you have faith. And how he'll take care of you if you have faith is he'll give you money. If you believe in God really hard, then you're going to live wealthy. That poverty is a curse, and we're blessed, and therefore, if you hold on to him, you're going to be blessed. And they'll take this verse all by itself, and they'll say what Paul was saying was that if you believed in God, you would be rich. He's rich, and he'll make you rich. And there's two or three things that are wrong with that line of thinking. The first big obvious one is all that foundation I just led you through. Paul was in prison. When Paul's saying all this stuff, he doesn't have anything. If this church in Philippi wasn't sending him money, he might not have enough food to eat. So when Paul says that God's going to take care of me out of his riches, he's not talking about money, because Paul's not got any money. He's talking about that contentment. I can do all things through Christ who gives me strength. I've learned the secret of being content. I'm amply supplied, right? And again, it's something that you can have whether you're rich or poor, but it comes from trust in him. I'm putting God first. I want God's will to be my will. I want his things to be my things. And when you live that way, then you're going to be rich inside. I don't want to make I'm going to keep going. I don't want to get hung up here too long. But this notion of being rich in Paul's perspective is when you don't need anything. If you're living in a 600 square foot tiny house and you've got a 30-year-old car, but you don't need anything, and you look at that and say, wow, what a great house. Man, you're rich, right? But there are other people who can live in a 5,000 square foot house and have 2 new cars in the driveway, and all they are is discontent. Rich is when you don't need anything anymore. When any gift, it really is a blessing because you don't need it. It's a joy. Some of us are so wealthy. I mean, Christmas is kind of dull. Birthdays are kind of, oh, great, you got me another sweater. Yeah, go in the cat, whatever. And it means nothing, right? We've got so much stuff that it doesn't even register. And Paul's not saying that God will give you even more stuff. That's just not what he's saying. The other big thing that's wrong with this line of thinking is that a person who has a little bit less than the person they're sitting beside in the pew might be tempted to think about themselves, well, maybe my faith is broken. Maybe if I had more faith, I'd be like the Joneses. They have more stuff, and maybe if my faith was better, I'd be like them. And it can make the Joneses feel like, well, maybe I'm really where I need to be because I've got all this stuff. God must be blessing me. He's not blessing the Smiths, so therefore, and it's not what he's saying. Something gets lost in translation when you take it that way. That's not what Paul's about here. Remember, too, when Paul's saying this, when Kenneth Copeland says it, when Joel Osteen uses it in one of his sermons, what he's hoping, Copeland especially, more than Osteen, Copeland's hoping that you'll send him a check. Copeland, when he tells you this thing, is telling you, if you'll send me more money, God will give you even more money. Copeland had a deal for a while that if you'd send him $100, God would give you 1,000. Which makes me want to write to Copeland, won't you give me 100 then? And see if God give you 1,000. But it doesn't, he never would write back. This notion about, remember again, in context, the Philippians have already given their money. He's not baiting them for more. And in fact, Paul's already told them, you don't have to give me anything, I'm doing fine. He's not using this verse as a way to get people to give more. He's just using this verse to remind people that no matter what you give, and no matter what you do, God's watching you. And he sees when you're generous, and he keeps track of all that. And God, if you hold on to him, is going to take care of the stuff you need. Now, the biggest thing, I think, with Paul here is he's talking about God's going to get done the things that God wants to do. Hudson Taylor was a famous missionary, and he said, God's work, when God's work is done in God's way, for God's glory, it will not lack for God's supply. If you're doing what God wants for God's reasons, for his glory, God's going to take care of you. And that's what Paul's saying here. But remember, it may not be the way you want. Paul's in prison when he writes this. It may not be how you hope God will take care of you. It may not be in the method or the manner that you're hoping, but he promises to. And this is true for you too. If you make a decision to put God first and say, God, I'm going to make you in charge, he might ask for some of your stuff. He might ask you to take some risks. He might ask you to push out there real hard. And you'll have to decide whether or not you trust him. That if you do it, that he's going to meet your need. If your need in your head is all material, it'll be very hard to trust God on that. I've done marriage counseling for couples sometimes where a husband comes in and he's just completely bewildered. His wife is getting on him. You're not here for us. You're not taking care of us. And he's getting more and more ticked off the longer the conversation is going on. What do you mean I'm not there for you? Everything we have is because I work hard. Look at this house. Look at these cars. I provide and provide and provide. Everything I do is for you guys. And he believes that when he says it. He's not just saying it. But we know, don't we, that there's more to being a good dad than just bringing money in. But I see increasingly couples that kind of sell themselves out, that husband and wife who are both just working crazy hours, hoping their kids will figure out how to take care of themselves because they have all these things to pay for. And it's hard to believe that that's God's biggest dream for you, that you'd be able to get even more overtime or be able to work even more hours. That God, his biggest concern for you would be that you just have a bigger nest egg one day. I mean, part of it gets to what you really believe about God and what you really think about God. God's all the time working in this world, and he wants us to be on it with him, partners with him in the work of reaching out to everybody. And sometimes he's going to call you to take some big chances. Paul has a different take on money than most of people do. In 1 Timothy chapter 6, he says the love of money is the root of all kinds of evil. Now, sometimes this gets simplified to saying money is evil, and that's not what he's saying, or even that money is the root of all evil. He's not saying that either. The love of money is the root of all kinds of evil. That's a curious thing. Let me pause here just for a second. I think I mentioned this about 2 or 3 months ago. An interesting thing for me, I think it's interesting, it may not be interesting to you, but an interesting thing to me is I've been in ministry now for right at 30 years. I've been in ministry for 30 years, and during the 30 years, different people have come to me who are having trouble with one thing or another. Or I've went to people sometimes where I've had trouble with one thing or another and said, here, help me with this. And I've been part of, on one side or the other, a lot of Christian counseling through the years where you're trying to help people figure some stuff out. I've had people come to me and tell me they struggle with lust or with anger or with pride. Sometimes somebody will come and say, I'm anxious all the time. I'm depressed. The world seems dark to me. I've lost all my interest in praying or reading or worship or whatever else. And you'll talk about it. I've helped people negotiate marriages that are falling apart and trouble with their kids and what to do about their how they spend. I've had people come to me and they talk about I struggle with this or that or the other thing. One thing nobody has ever came to me to say they struggle with is they've never come and said, I'm greedy. Of all the different sins. And even for you today, as a thought experiment while you're sitting there, and I can't tell if you're doing it, you'll have to just do it and I'll not know. When you think about what your number 2 or 3 or 4 problems are, your main 4 problems, I bet none of you guys think greed is in the top 4. Well, somebody must be sinning. They wouldn't put this in the Bible if somebody didn't struggle with it. Just none of us, right? So I think it's sneaky, this love of money thing. I don't think you see it right off. I think you have a way of telling yourself, well, that's somebody else. Yeah, I have some money, but I don't love it, you know. Jesus, I didn't put this one on the slide, but it's a great verse. Jesus in Luke chapter 16, he says this here. He says, no man can serve 2 masters. Either he's going to love one and hate the other, or he'll be devoted to one and despise the other. You can't serve God and money. And he's telling the Pharisees this. And it says the Pharisees who loved money heard all this, and they were sneering at Jesus. But he said to them, you're the ones who justify yourselves in the eyes of men, but God knows your heart. And what's highly valued among men is detestable in God's sight. Okay, what's highly valued among men? He's not saying money is detestable in God's sight. He could be, actually. He could be saying that. I don't think that's what he's saying, but it's possible he's saying money is detestable in God's sight. I don't think so. I think what he's saying again is that love of money. That's highly valued amongst men. Everybody that you bounce off will appreciate it if you've got a nice car, a nice house, nice clothes. They'll all compliment you on it, right? Oh, you got new shoes. I say that to people sometimes. Oh, hey, you got a new shirt. Hey, way to go. Or I mean, we notice stuff like that, right? What's highly valued to men, Jesus says, is detestable in God's sight. But when we make that our whole life, it's like we're burying ourselves. We're covering ourselves with all this stuff, and we miss something. And again, nobody thinks they struggle with it. Somebody told me a few weeks ago there's a couple different ways of looking at the world. You can look at it with a scarcity mindset, that there's not very much stuff to go around, so I better get mine while I can, or an abundance mindset. There's plenty. You know, if I lose this, no big deal. The scarcity mindset is the little kid at their birthday party, and they've been given all these toys, and they've got all the toys around them, right? While all their friends are looking at them sadly. Hey, I'd like to play. No, it's mine. It's all mine, right? If I let go of even one toy, then I'm going to lose something. There's scarcity, right? I got to keep it all. The abundance mindset, you just don't notice. There's a Seinfeld episode where Seinfeld loses $20 and then finds the $20 in his pocket. Hey, I'm even Steven. You know, you just figure it's all going to work out. Sooner or later, it's all going to come back. You don't worry about it. And admittedly, you don't want to go too far, I guess, on either deal. But what's curious is that a lot of times the person who has a lot sees the world as scarce. Like if I let go of this, what am I going to do? And that's how you test yourself to see if maybe this is a problem for you. Maybe if money is a thing. If your kid is driving the car and they call you and say, hey, now don't freak out, but I had a little wreck. And your first question is, how's the car? Right? It might be a problem. It might be. It might be something that you struggle with. If every time you go to a wedding or a grad party or a baby shower or whatever, you and your wife have an argument first. You're not giving them, how much we giving them? What do we do? We don't even know them that well. And you have that argument every time. If you have that argument every time church comes around, I don't think we should be giving all this money away. You know, if you have to, if you get asked for something and it's just hard to let go of it, whatever it is, it could be a car or your favorite whatever, or a guitar, or that was one of mine. I used to go to church camp in Tennessee, and I would play in the band, and there was every year there was one kid. He just kept coming up. I would see him. I know he'd be back, and he wanted to play my guitar, and it was an expensive guitar, and he was rough with it. You know, he's doing this with it, and he's rough with it. So I started bringing a cheap guitar to camp too, and I would play my guitar, and I'd put my guitar in the case and put the cheap guitar back on the stand when I was done. And so when the kid would come and say, hey, can I play your guitar? I said, there it is. Go play with it. And this worked for 2 or 3 days. And he goes, oh, no, not that one. I want to play that one in the case. And it's like, oh, and you feel the pressure of it. And it's hard to let go of it. It's hard to trust somebody to take your stuff. It's scarce. If I lose this thing, what am I going to do? If he breaks a string, what am I going to do? Well, I'll get a new string. But I don't think that way in the moment, right? When you love money, it's all you think about. I mean, your mind is constantly on your retirement. It's constantly on your hourly whatever. It's constantly on every last part of the house. And I'm not against budgets. You know, truthfully, most of the American problem with money is that all of us have a way of spending more than we make. And that's wrong, and that's sin. If we're being honest, it's not just dumb, it's sin. We shouldn't do that. The excessive debt that too many Christians want to get into, we shouldn't. And I want to help you with that. If you're in a struggle with that, that can ruin everything. Honestly, when a couple gets divorced, that's usually a big problem, where you can't even get along with each other, and money it seems like always gets tied up in that. It's big deal. And again, Paul's words start making sense. Well, you don't have to live that way. God will meet all your needs in Christ Jesus. Just put him first. Just give him everything. One last story. We can't do invitation anymore, and hopefully in September we're going to start that up again. And I miss it. I miss praying with people at the end of the service and trying to encourage them. So if anybody needs to talk about any of this afterward, I'm thrilled to talk to you about it. So come find me, and we'll socially distance safely apart, and we can talk about whatever you talk about. But it's a hard thing to admit, even after a service. It's a hard thing to own up to. So just be praying. Had somebody talk to me a week or two ago about the church, and about the church experience. And they said, you kind of pulled a bait and switch on me. And I didn't know what they meant. And they said, when I first started coming to church, and I've been coming to church a long, long time. When I first started coming to church, I didn't even want to come. My wife wanted me to come, wanted us to come. And I said, don't have to do anything, do I? He says, no. He's got to sit there and then we'll leave. And he goes, well, I can sit there. I'm good at sitting, so I can do that. So he came, and I kind of liked it. After we were there for a while, then I found out you were supposed to give money. And so I gave a little money, and then I found out you were supposed to get involved in a Sunday school or something. It just seems like you're always asking for more. And it made me realize that maybe we have pulled a bait and switch on this thing. Maybe we've not been completely clear about what Christ is asking for and what he's talking about. So let me help with that today, if any of you feel some of that. Jesus wants everything. I don't want everything. I wouldn't know what to do with your everything, but Jesus wants everything. He wants you to trust him with everything. The big stuff, the small stuff, the important stuff, the unimportant stuff, he wants it all. He wants it all. And one of the last strongholds for most of us, the thing that we have a hard time trusting him with, is our finances. We can trust him with so many different things, but that money stuff, that's a tough one, even though none of us think we struggle with it. And so I just want to challenge you today with this verse behind me to trust him. To trust him. See if this really isn't the secret to being content in any and every circumstance. And see if he doesn't, in fact, meet your needs. Because the cruel part about life is that one day you have to hand it all back anyway. You don't get to take anything with you. Even the very body that you walk around in, you have to give to him one day. He's going to get all of it. And in return for what he takes, and he takes it all eventually, he gives you more. But you got to trust him. So let me pray for you for that.